At 3 a.m. in the forests of Saxony, a group of pilgrims lay awake by a dying fire, listening. Not sleeping, listening. Someone had heard footsteps an hour earlier, somewhere past the tree line, and now every snapped twig sounded like a decision being made about whether they would see morning. There was no 911 to call, no park ranger, no app showing the nearest town. If something happened out here, in the space between two villages that might be 15 miles apart, whatever happened would happen without witnesses, without records, and without help. And this wasn't a rare night. This was Tuesday. This was every night, for weeks at a time, for anyone who left home in medieval Europe. We like to imagine the past as slower and simpler, quieter, but strip away the castles and the tapestries and look at the actual mechanics of getting from one place to another, and you find something closer to a survival system. A set of rules, tricks, and quiet negotiations that an entire class of people relied on just to reach their destination alive. No maps you could trust, no police, no guarantee the person renting you a room wasn't planning to rob you in it. So how did they actually do it? How did ordinary people, not knights, not kings, just merchants and monks and pilgrims and messengers, walk across a continent with none of the safety nets we take for granted? The first thing to understand is how far away from safety actually was. On foot, a traveller carrying luggage covered something like 9 to 15 miles a day. A horse could push that to 20 or 25. Professional couriers, men whose entire job was speed, could sometimes manage 50 or 60. But most people weren't couriers. Most people were walking, and walking meant 8 to 10 hours on your feet, one step after another, through terrain that hadn't been graded, drained, or maintained in any meaningful sense since the Roman roads had crumbled centuries earlier. That mattered because it meant the gaps between towns weren't a few minutes of highway. They were entire days. A pilgrim setting out from an abbey might not see another roof, another fire, another living soul outside their own party for 2 or 3 days straight, which meant every single trip required carrying an entire survival kit on your back because there was nowhere to resupply and no one coming to check on you if you ran out. So they planned around bread, specifically dry bread, baked hard enough to survive weeks in a sack, meant to be softened with water or wine before eating. Alongside it, cured meat, hard cheese, dried fruit. Nothing fresh, nothing perishable, nothing that needed a fire to be safe to eat because you couldn't count on having one every night. And here's the detail that surprises people. They mostly avoided drinking the water, not out of superstition, but because water sources along the road were unreliable and often contaminated, and nobody had a way to test them. Wine kept longer, traveled better, and was less likely to make you sick. So a pilgrim's pack usually held more wine than water, not because medieval people loved to drink, but because wine was, in a very real sense, safer to swallow. Every choice out here was a trade-off between two bad options. Walk the exposed road where bandits could see you coming, or cut through the forest where you couldn't see them coming either. Drink questionable water, or carry heavier, bulkier wine that added weight to every mile you'd already have to walk. There was no clean solution, just less risky and more risky. Which brings us to the part of the day nobody plans for in a modern trip. Where do you sleep when the sun goes down and you're nowhere near a town? If you were lucky, you'd reach a monastery. Religious houses across Europe were expected, almost obligated, to offer travelers shelter and food, and pilgrims in particular could usually count on a bed within the walls of an abbey or a hospice built specifically for that purpose. It wasn't charity exactly, it was closer to infrastructure. A network of guest houses stitched together across the continent, run by people whose faith told them turning away a traveler was a moral failure. But you couldn't always make it to one. And when you couldn't, you slept in the woods, in a circle, with someone awake at all times. Groups of travelers took turns on watch through the night, the way soldiers would, because the forest after dark held real threats. Wolves, wild animals drawn by the smell of a cook fire, and bandits who knew exactly which routes travelers used and exactly which hours those travelers were most vulnerable. A fire was kept burning through the night, not for warmth alone, but because fire kept the things in the dark from getting close. People who wrote about these nights described leaving bread offerings in the trees, hoping to appease spirits they genuinely believed might do them harm, right alongside the very practical fear of the men who might do them harm. And even the road itself was a kind of gamble, because for most of the journey there was no reliable map telling you what came next. The most famous surviving map of medieval Britain, drawn on vellum roughly the size of a door, showed towns as little clusters of red roofs and rivers as flowing green lines. Useful for understanding the general shape of a kingdom. Useless for knowing whether the bridge marked on it still existed, or whether the road had washed out in last spring's flooding. Travellers relied far more on word of mouth than paper. You asked the last person coming from where you were headed. You asked at the monastery gate. You pieced together your route one conversation at a time, updating it constantly, because the map in your head was always a few weeks out of date the moment you left home. Bridges made this worse, not better. Where they existed at all, they were often privately owned toll points, controlled by whoever's land they sat on, and you paid whatever they demanded or you turned back. Where they didn't exist, you were left with a ford, a shallow crossing point you hoped was shallow enough, or a ferry, which came with its own risk. Ferrymen along busy pilgrim routes were notorious for charging wildly inflated prices to travellers who had no alternative and no leverage. You were standing on one side of a river with a raider-infested road behind you and a stranger in a boat in front of you asking for more money than you had budgeted, and you paid it because turning around wasn't really an option either. Here's the thing though, reaching a town didn't mean the danger was over, it just changed shape. Inns existed along major routes, but the quality swung wildly, from respectable houses that fed and sheltered you honestly, to places where the innkeeper was, quite literally, part of the risk. There was no licensing board, no reviews. No way to know, walking in off the road exhausted and low on money, whether the man handing you a room key was going to rob you in your sleep. Travellers judged an inn the same way you judge a stranger's intentions on instinct, because instinct was often the only tool they had. This is what no inns you could trust actually meant in practice. It wasn't that inns didn't exist. It's that trusting one was a gamble every single time, with your money, your belongings, and sometimes your life on the table. So people built their own systems of protection because no one else was going to. The most basic one was numbers. Bandits picked off the isolated. A lone traveller on a forest road was an easy target. A caravan of 30 merchants guarded by hired swords was not. So people who had never met before a journey began would form travelling parties out of pure necessity. Pilgrims banding with pilgrims, merchants banding with merchant guilds, because there was safety in exactly the way you'd expect. Wealthier travellers went further and paid for armed escorts, sometimes hiring knights or mercenaries specifically to guard a caravan's goods and people through the most dangerous stretches of road. Then there was paperwork, believe it or not. Letters of recommendation and letters of protection, issued by a lord, a bishop, or a king, could open doors in foreign territory that would otherwise stay shut. A letter told a stranger's guard or a stranger's innkeeper that you were vouched for by someone with power, and in a world with no passports and no way to verify a person's identity on site. A letter with the right seal was one of the only forms of credibility that travelled with you. Pilgrims had their own version of this. Badges, worn openly, marked you as someone on a religious journey, someone the church expected local communities to protect, not exploit. It didn't stop every bad actor. Nothing did. But it shifted the odds, and shifting the odds was the entire game. Money moved differently too, and that was its own quiet danger. Carrying a sack of coins across a continent crawling with bandits was an obvious risk. So wealthier travellers and merchant guilds began relying on money changers and early forms of credit. Arrangements where a merchant in one city could deposit funds and collect an equivalent sum from a contact in another, never physically carrying the full amount along the road. It wasn't available to everyone. A poor pilgrim still walked with whatever coin fit in a pouch under their clothes, hoping it wouldn't be found. But for those who could access it, moving value without moving metal was one more way of removing yourself as a target. And class shaped almost every part of this equation, more than people realize. A wealthy traveller could carry spare clothing, better food, hired servants, physicians on retainer, and pack animals to replace anything that broke along the way. If a horse went lame or a cartwheel split, money solved the problem within a day. A poorer traveller had none of that cushion. They depended directly on the charity of monasteries, hospitals, and roadside alms, on cheap inns of uncertain safety, on the goodwill of fellow travelers willing to share a fire. For the wealthy, the road was uncomfortable and occasionally dangerous. For the poor, a single piece of bad luck, a stolen coin purse, an infected cut, a broken ankle, could be the difference between finishing the journey and dying somewhere along it. One of the most vivid accounts we have comes from a pilgrim named Ceolwulf, writing about the road toward Jerusalem in the early 12th century. He described a mountain pass so dangerous that the road itself was lined with bodies, people killed by wild animals or by raiders who knew the terrain and used it. He wrote that on that stretch it wasn't just the poor and the weak who were in danger, the rich and the strong were in danger too. Wealth bought you better food and better company. It didn't buy you immunity. Further along other pilgrim routes, accounts describe robbers who specifically targeted travelers' horses, ferrymen who extorted absurd fees to cross a river you had no other way around, and toll collectors in certain regions who would beat a traveler and take the money by force if he hesitated to pay. These weren't rare horror stories passed around campfires. They were common enough that pilgrim guidebooks of the era warned travelers about them by name, route by route, the way a modern guidebook might warn you about a pickpocket district. And underneath all of it sat the quietest danger of all, one that had nothing to do with bandits or bad innkeepers. Disease. Every journey exposed a traveler to pathogens their body had never encountered, carried by every other traveler moving along the same roads from other regions, other countries, other climates. A cut that would be a minor annoyance at home could become a fatal infection with no doctor for 50 miles. A broken leg on a forest road, with the nearest help 2 days away, could be the quiet end of someone's entire life, with nothing more dramatic than bad luck and bad timing. There's a darker version of this that only becomes visible with hindsight. The same roads and pilgrimage routes that connected the medieval world, the same merchant caravans and monastery way stations that made travel survivable, were also the exact channels the Great Plague outbreaks used to move across the continent. Every traveller carrying goods from one region to another was, without knowing it, capable of carrying something far more dangerous than stolen silver. The network that kept people alive by connecting them was the same network that occasionally killed them by connecting them. Nobody understood that trade-off at the time. They just knew that people who travelled sometimes came home sick, and people who stayed home sometimes got sick anyway, because the travellers had already passed through weeks before. Periods of relative peace changed the math in the travellers' favour when they happened. Under an enforced truce, or what was sometimes called the peace of God, local lords agreed to restrain their feuds and their armed men, and roads that were normally dangerous became briefly survivable in a different way. Travellers timed journeys around these windows when they could, because a road that ran through contested territory during an active feud was a road you avoided entirely if you had any choice in the matter, and mercenary bands left unpaid after a war had ended were often more dangerous than the war itself had been. So why did anyone do this? Why did merchants, messengers, monks, and pilgrims keep walking out into a world with none of the systems we now consider basic? Because the alternative was staying still, and staying still had its own cost. Trade didn't happen without someone willing to move goods between towns. Faith didn't reach a shrine without someone willing to walk toward it. Messages didn't reach a king without a rider willing to cross contested land to deliver them. The road was dangerous, but the world needed people who would take that danger on anyway, and enough of them did that entire networks of trade routes, pilgrimage paths, and monastery way stations grew up across the continent and held together for centuries. That's really the detail that should change how you picture all this. It wasn't chaos. Given everything working against it, that shouldn't have been possible. But it was survivable often enough that students crossed Europe for university, that merchants made the same routes year after year, that pilgrims returned home and told their neighbours it could be done, and their neighbours packed their own bread and set out to do it too. They didn't have maps you could trust. They built trust instead, out of letters and badges and travelling in numbers and monasteries that opened their doors to strangers because turning someone away felt like a sin. They didn't have police, they built their own version. Armed escorts, night watches, whole parties of ordinary people agreeing to protect each other because no one else would. They didn't have inns you could count on, so they learned to read a room, a face, a town. The same instinct you'd use walking into an unfamiliar place today. Except for them, it wasn't a precaution. It was the only thing standing between them and disaster. Every solution they built was really just a way of replacing a system that didn't exist yet with people. People vouching for people. People guarding people. People feeding strangers because someday they'd be the stranger needing to be fed. Next time you're annoyed your GPS rerouted you 5 minutes out of the way, or your hotel booking has a bad review you can check before you commit. Remember, there was a version of travel where none of that existed, and people did it anyway, mile after mile, night after night, trusting almost nothing except each other. Would you have made it? Not the walking part, the trusting part. Because that's really what the road demanded, and it's the part most of us have never had to test.